The older I get, the more convinced I am about the concept of shared humanity.
Being Team Australia, that doesn't mean you can't be Team the rest of them. I really wanted to chat to you because I wanted to understand what it is that work looks like for someone in your position, and how do you engage with this idea of this thing called work?
Because I thought you were going to ask me about the Italy game, so that's good. We don't need
to then we're going to go we can do that if you want.
No, just kidding. We don't have to relive all that pain. But the way I approach my working life is just through purpose and passion. And that kind of brings its own challenges because I don't feel motivated. I don't feel willing to spend any time working on anything in my life which I don't think it's not going to resonate with what I believe in and what it is I'm trying to achieve. And so, and some of that might come out of athletics. I don't quite know, but you sports people are a bit like dancers, right? The particularly dancing and music are very similar to us in that often that passion comes very early. And I have 3 children, and as a former athlete, one of the things that I most wish for them as young children is that they can find a passion early. So athletes are very fortunate in that way, but it's a two-edged sword because that career of passion comes early. For me, was kind of early teens. And the more talent that you have, the better that you perform, the more positive feedback you receive. And by that, I mean representative distinction. And then, and then typically within your local community, that'll be picked up by small media outlets. And all of a sudden, this is just a typical pattern for a young sports person, female or male. And then, of course, people around in a country like Australia then are saying, look, this is really wonderful, what you're doing, and you love doing it. And there's a lot of positive, feeling around. Everyone loves it, and the family comes and watches it, and really starts to live through sport, which is an extraordinary vehicle for bringing families together. And bringing then a broader social circles together, and then bringing society together, as you talked about with bringing them together in joint experiences, whether that's joy, like 2006 or 2005 qualification, or whether that's a devastation like the Italy game. So having come through sport in that way, that this sense of a real driving passion that every day you want to achieve something that you love is both a blessing and a curse, because I think athletes many of them struggle with it post-career. And it's because the other issue is in your young life, you found something of great value to yourself and you're led to believe that it's of wonderful value to society. We can argue that. But it's gone by early 30s, and for the greats, maybe late 30s. And often the focus within that career, within that work environment must be so intense that it precludes tremendous social development, cognitive development in the sense of, a broad social understanding, political understanding, so it inhibits a great deal of other growth that people need in their late 30s, 40s and 50s to actually succeed in other areas of life. And so the trend has been, in recent decades to understand that and try to educate athletes and so on. I started a law degree when I was young, and I was one who I was not able to combine a young family, a law degree and a professional football international career. And so I had to go back and study in my late 20s, 30s, various masters of sport management and things. And I finished my law degree at 50, which was just last year. I had to go back to it because, again, the thing that athletes love is a challenge, where we are conditioned to be challenge seeking and quite often risk seeking people, human beings. But from a very young age, that kind of immediate response to a challenge that's put in front of someone in sport is well developed. Otherwise, you simply cannot overcome the injuries, the opponents, being demoted, and every athlete has the same issues. So it produces it's an interesting field because it produces a range of responses and conditions, a range of social and usually, very often, socially acceptable and desirable qualities, but it also distances athletes. We talk about the sports bubble, and it does put them in an environment where you could put the intensity of a sporting career, into a crucible, and an international sporting career, or a great player of some type of international global sport. And, that amount of intensity in that short period of time of 15 years, I wouldn't be surprised if it's more than what most human beings experience in a lifetime. Athletes have purpose by nature. Athletes have passion. Otherwise, you cannot get up every day and just flog your body to the nth degree. It's just not possible unless you can be focused on a goal, but you still must love it. When the love goes, you simply can't do it, and you can't perform at that level. So that, I think a lot of us, the fortunate ones, are able to take that essence and just apply it for the rest of our lives.
I was wondering, one of the things that we talk about is how you find your purpose at work. I mean, many people go to jobs that it's really hard to see the line of sight to the purpose of what you're doing. And I guess what it sounds like, it comes naturally to you, and you're advocating that if you're going to make it as a sports person, then maybe the people who filter to the top, it comes naturally to them as well, is being able to really quickly find a sense of purpose that's bigger than you.
Well, that's right. So, we're fortunate in the sense some sports, I find them at different ages. For us is kind of early teens in football until, late 20s, early 30s. And so in the first part of your life, before you really mature, as a social animal, that is understanding the world, you've already experienced the beauty of this incredible thing called passion and love for what you do, and purpose and driving every day to achieve something, and confronting challenges every single day. So, it's... But as I said before, the many athletes then struggle because other people come to that over time, and they might not get it till kind of the 30s, 40s, and they're just working, and the social life might be important, and there's, our family life. And for athletes, it's difficult to find it later. It's almost like you get this huge sugar hit in the first third of your life, and then many are trying to find that sugar hit for the rest of their life, and it can be really difficult. But what I would say is one thing that holds people back, and all of us, is this journey of materialism, that has happened in the world, certainly in the Western world anyway, over a very long period of time. And so people get caught in needing to just pay their bills and needing to just get the next house or the next car, and never actually perhaps ask themselves or challenge themselves the question. And sadly, many people get to the end of their lives and never found it. That's where COVID-19, actually, that was one of the silver linings of an awful experience for the world, right? Was that people, for the first time, their life stopped. And that's a very rare phenomenon, incredibly rare phenomenon. And we all want to feel that we've spent our life for something.
I guess, and what I'm hearing and what you're saying is there's a real search for authenticity. This search for, it's not just about living the values, but knowing what the values are in the first place, and really being able to articulate what I believe in, what I think is right and wrong, what I really hold true and dear to me. And I guess what I heard you saying earlier on is that sports people who get involved in elite sport early almost have this accelerated path of what's important to me right now and my purpose. And I guess what you're saying then is that if that purpose and authenticity doesn't have another place to go, then it really flounders to some extent.
Yeah, and there's a lot of in former athletes. There's a lot of depression. There's a high level of risk taking, and certainly in professional footballers worldwide, and in the Premier League in England, there's a greater than average incidence of bankruptcy and these types of things. What you see is people who are forced to take extreme professional risks. Because going out in front of a crowd and a global TV audience and putting yourself in that environment where things can go badly wrong or very good, is something that most people never really have to experience. You can argue about the social value of playing for the Socceroos or being a professional footballer, okay, and there are many views on that. But what you can't argue is that it is a very condensed period of time of extreme level of a purpose and passion being brought to life, and then it's a matter of how you apply that elsewhere. So the reason I started there is because that's basically the way I live my life. So I have been at SBS television for 18 years, almost 2 decades, and resisted opportunities to work in other broadcasting fields over a very long period of time because that's what I loved. That's what I love. That's the organisation I wanted to be at, and that's passion. So, and I could apply the passion that I have for this particular pursuit to my daily work in a way that at that time I very likely couldn't elsewhere. Okay, but then when it comes to purpose, there was more to that. SBS was about multiculturalism through football. SBS never put football on air simply because Les Murray and Johnny Warren loved football. That wasn't the point. They put football on air because they love football and knew that it's a vehicle it's a window to inclusion, diversity, equality. Johnny and Les would talk about all the communities, all the Croats and Italians, and this is what we're talking about today. So they used to call it the mission. Well, what is the mission? Well, the mission is to change Australia through the multicultural game. They'd lived through, their era was migration and the struggle that Australia had with new ethnic communities. Those ethnic communities played football. They saw the social problems Australia was having through migration and loved all of these people because it's our football community, and wanted to use football on SBS to teach Australia about other ethnicities and other cultures. And so when I found that was, that just hit me straight away. I was just completely aligned. I said, that's exactly what I'm looking for. So to go from an athletic career to then broadcasting with a mission, that's perfect. But, when you talk about purpose, the other point about it was not just what a multicultural sport can do for a country in integration and understanding and cohesion, but also one of the overriding factors was about Australia being successful in the World Cup. Okay, and that's about nation building. And, the older I get, the more convinced I am about the concept of shared humanity. And the less convinced I am of the value of driving hard this sense of nationalism.
It's almost like you can be Team Australia. That doesn't mean you can't be Team the rest of the world.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly, that's spot on. Like, this is not about exclusion, and so, but that's a whole other, social and political discussion. But the thing about winning the World Cup, I believed and believe, is that we could do a number of things. We could provide a vehicle for tremendous multiculturalism through this institution of a sporting national team. And when you connect positive emotion and immense national pride to a team that wins something, you change the views of the people who did it. And when they qualified in 2005, I'm pretty sure they had 9 different cultural backgrounds in that team. So Mark Viduka is one of the most famous Croatian Australians.
Mm.
You know, Mark Schwarzer is one of the most famous German Australians, right? And so it provides a vehicle for a discussion around multiculturalism, which is quite unique. You know, I remember after that game in 2005 when the guys qualified at Australia Stadium, as it was at the time, I remember walking out with Les, and it was a Indonesian man came up to us, and he was just in tears, right? And he said, I feel Australian tonight. And I said to him, what are you talking about? Like, and he said, well, I've been here 15 years and I've never felt Australian. I don't kind of get these other sports. You know, Indonesia's a massive football country, right? So, and so he said, you know, and finally, Australia has accepted my game, and I can be in a stadium. This is paraphrasing. I can be in a stadium with every other person from every corner of the world. We're all Australian. I'm a citizen, and we all are together feeling something positive for the country. He said, that's the first time I've had that since I've been a citizen here for the last 10 years. That's actually, so we talk a lot about the power of sport, and much of it is trite, but that's actually true, right? And the other reason that I think Australia, you know, winning the female and male World Cups would be hugely valuable, if handled in the right way, is I would like to see us on that stage genuinely reconcile with and express our Indigenous culture. And that's always been very important to me. And so, you know, to do that on the global stage would provide Indigenous Australia with a window to talk to the world, to demonstrate themselves, to show their culture, to talk about, you know, the 65,000 years. You know, you imagine the oldest living culture on the earth, where the Australian national teams are actually, you know, part of it. And you know, that vehicle, that experience is like nothing else that Indigenous Australia can possibly experience. That might be a bit idealistic, but I think people don't know what it can mean to a country to actually win, you know, a FIFA World Cup. So when I was a chairman a couple of years ago of the players in 2016 of the Players Association, the Players Union, I pushed hard for instance, Socceroos and Matildas to use an anthem on the global stage which had Indigenous language in it. To play in Indigenous shirts, to you know, have a range of cultural symbolism that, and in a substantive way, to do this in agreement with Indigenous Australia peak bodies. And the Wallabies have done this really well, but to do this actually on the global stage in the global sport, and sadly we're not there yet, but I hope that we will be one day.
Just moving a little bit away from sport for a moment, I feel like hearing you speak and sort of following you on social media and watching what you're doing, I feel like it was inevitable that you were going to fall into social justice in some way. Was Hakim the kind of the entry point for that for you? Was that a vehicle of some sort for you?
It was in some ways a bit of an inflection point, but it had been building over a very long period of time. So when I was a Socceroo, I was a part of the Republican movement. So I was politically aware, and I was speaking at the town hall with Malcolm Turnbull and other athletes on the need for a republic, which I still believe today. And part of that is about reconciling with Indigenous Australia. And I was involved even as a player in social programs. So I would take time as a player to go and coach young Indigenous players and teams, for instance. And I was very interested in seeing the situation of people that hadn't been given what I'd been given. And, you know, that struck me, you know, very hard. So I went up into remote community areas quite early and worked on some, you know, Indigenous football programs. But I felt strongly about, you know, just injustice and need. And this concept of a shared humanity between us all was always, you know, very important to me. So And then what happened is I then started, I was studying law and doing all these things. So I started to then, of course, move into directorships and legal reform and start to work on particularly funding. And so I, got a few million to build a football centre up in my home area, where up in northern New South Wales, where I wanted to use that for engagement with Asia Pacific, but also particularly for Indigenous children, provide opportunities and so on. So that's kind of the next step, I think. And finally, it becomes about social activism. There's different levels of social change making, and the older we get, if that's not our profession, I think it's natural that we come to them in a progressive way. And what happened with Hakim and refugees was a big one. Les Murray was a refugee. And so I was already working with a range of refugee organisations. I've moved into human rights. And again, I go back to the SBS. I never undertook a role, which I could have done at SBS or elsewhere, that was full-time, that was going to take my time away from all of these causes. So I had a mission in football, but I also had missions outside football, and they were important to me. And then what happened was I became a refugee community sponsorship program ambassador and human rights ambassador with Amnesty, and then Hakim got in trouble. So Hakim was just an example of someone that I was already helping. It was just that he was in a different type of trouble. And so it was natural that people came to me. I was working for a decade with refugee kids in real distress, new arrivals from particularly sub-Sahara Africa, through a program with University of New South Wales called Football United, which is in the School of Community Health and Medicine. And so research around the use of football to integrate and socialise young traumatised refugees. So I had been doing that for 10 years. So then Hakim got in trouble. He's a refugee. So, and he was in football. So, so any of those things about him would have meant that I was going to fight for him. But altogether meant that I knew what he'd been through. I knew these kids. Right? Bahrain was different to Africa or Iraq or Iran or Afghanistan. And so I didn't really know the context of Bahrain, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter. He'd been tortured. And so had all these kids that I'd met and become friends with, and still speak to today. So again, it was just the purpose. This is part of my worldview. This is part of my life view, is that this kid has been put in this situation, which is improper. And that could be any of us. And I've built a position in society where I'm capable of doing something here. And there's no alternative to doing something. And that carried very significant professional risk.
You suggested that, even though you've always been involved with refugees, that, there was an inflection of some sort. The work that you've done since then has all had it's like an elevated public profile to some extent, to all of the sorts of the social justice issues that you've tackled, or the causes that you've supported along the way. How do you, and I guess what I hear beyond the passion is also then this overwhelming generosity that comes with that. How do you sustain yourself? It sounds exhausting. To me, like the number of things. I follow you on social media and I see the number of things that you're doing in a day, and I'm like, is that from today as well? I don't quite believe that. So how do you sustain the energy without burning out and without kind of digging a little hole to sort of bury yourself in? How do you sustain it?
Well, yeah, there is a toll, but there's a far greater toll on the people who work in this full time. So I've been fortunate, but also been able to create an environment where I can go between the two worlds, and that's how I like it. That's how I want it. So I love the sport of football and working in it in whatever, and being part of it in whatever capacity. That can be the players or broadcasting or whatever. But that also amplifies my opportunity to run social campaigns and help on social causes. And so they're, symbiotic. but football and sport is the exit point from a different type of emotion. And so football and broadcasting sport and talking about, you know, in that media environment is kind of like where it's positive energy. You know, that's where I go to get some sustenance. And then that's how I feel anyway. And then I go and spend it for people who need it. That's kind of how I conceptualize it. And I could go and do a Champions League game or a Socceroo game or go to a World Cup or do these things. And, you know, that'll sustain me for a couple of years. And then certainly a World Cup
especially if we
does.
win, right? If we won, then God, that's like a century.
Yeah, well, that's true. That's true. That's true. It would never stop. I'm sure that high would never stop.
I'm really conscious of how much time you've given me. I can't get this generosity thing is like, is overwhelming. One last question. If, you know, we talk to a lot of people, we teach a lot of resilience programs, resilience at work and things of that nature. And one of the things that people are struggling with at the moment is this level of uncertainty around the world. And, you know, maybe we're okay in Australia, but it doesn't stop that everything you're doing is with a background of uncertainty at work and, you know, working differently, those sorts of things. What advice would you give to people? Maybe they're feeling a bit wobbly, maybe they're feeling a bit shaken up by things that are going on, and particularly people who feel really passionate about the Black Lives Matter campaigns around the world, that, you know, they feel a little bit helpless or feel like they're unable to participate in the way they really want to. What advice would you give people who aren't kind of feeling on top of the game at the moment right now?
You know, in many ways, you know, I recognize that I have a very fortunate life, and, you know, and my experience has been different to many. And the reason I'm always cautious and to say that is because, you know, I work with a lot of asylum seekers, refugees, you know, and homeless people who have far, far greater challenges than I. And, you know, at least 50%, if not more, of my life now is trying to actually help them. So, you know, it's difficult to give advice to them from the ivory tower in which I live. You know, here I am in, you know, in a lovely home environment where I've been able to work in different fields which are visible and you know, provide me a position in society which, you know, is the polar opposite of where they are. So I don't know how well placed I am to, you know, give people advice. Or what I might just say is this, that, you know, my feeling is that change is inevitable, and that what COVID has done is provide people perhaps a lot of discomfort, because it's interrupted and disrupted our view of what it is that who we are, which is linked with what we do, which doesn't always have to be the case. And this conceptualization of what society should be and our place in it has been challenged, but it comes down to this concept of purpose, and having an opportunity to just sit and reflect, even though forced and problematic, has actually been really valuable for a lot of people. And if you've taken the time to think about that, then my advice is act on it.
Yeah.
Okay? Because you know, I'm more acutely aware every day, you know, because I'm 51 now, and I just continually say to my wife, well, what is going to be our or your or my contribution between now and the end of our lives? We might feel as though we've made some, and we can judge whether that's been enough. But that's the way I look at it. You know, what is your contribution to society and to others? Money gives opportunities and choices, and those without shouldn't be. And there's no balance in the world at the moment. But money for its own sake is not going to deliver you purpose. Okay. And by the time you hit 60 and want to do your own foundation and then give back, you've spent the majority of your life. So every day, I see every day as something to spend. And I want to make sure I spend it in ways that is going to make some difference. And if that's the way you feel, and I think that that's human nature. I just think that there's a lot of constraints in society that take us away from that position. So my advice is to just sit and say, if I had the opportunity, putting other considerations aside, what is it that I would most deeply love to do, to be seen to do, to be known for, and what would I like to contribute? And then if you go and take that, you'd be surprised at the magic that comes along with that, because I actually think human beings are designed for that. That's actually what we're supposed to do. That's the question everyone should ask, is what am I here for?
Yeah.
And I ask it all the time, and I think I'd encourage others to do likewise. And that takes risk. It takes risk to really chase that, but you've got to do it.
Courageous self-conversations. That's what it sounds like to me.